You are good. We're live.
You're on mute, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my Zoom for some reason restarted just then when you started the live. So I want to welcome everybody. Yeah, my Zoom started just then. Okay, so welcome everyone. So this is the EPA Science Advisory Board CASTNet review panel. We are holding a public meeting today to review the report and recommendations of this panel. So good afternoon. My name is Brian Bloomer, and I'm the designated federal officer for the EPA Science Advisory Board's Clean Air Status and Trends Ambient Air Monitoring Network, commonly referred to as CASTNet review panel. In my role as the designated federal official, I am formally opening this public meeting. The EPA Science Advisory Board, often referred to as the SAB, is an independent, expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, also known as FACA. This panel, and all panels of the SAB, provide advice through the Chartered Science Advisory Board. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, commonly referred to as ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on scientific and technical aspects of the EPA's decisions, regulatory actions, and activities. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations of the panel and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where a DFO is present, ensuring that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for oral and written public comment. There is a public comment period noted on the agenda today where members of the public who would have registered in advance with the SAB staff office could have made an oral comment. Today, we have no registered speakers to address the panel during that time, so we will move more rapidly into the main body of the agenda. Upon conclusion of the meeting, please note that minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with requirements of FACA and will be posted on the SAB website at sab.epa.gov within 90 working days of the conclusion of this meeting. Please note that SAB panel members are special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, they are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality under ethics regulations specified in 5 CFR 2635 relating to the topic of this meeting. All materials pertaining to this meeting can be accessed on the SAB website. Again, that's sab.epa.gov under the upcoming meetings link, clicking on today's meeting. Before turning the meeting over to the chair, I would like to set the context for today's meeting. So in the process, the SAB follows to develop and provide scientific and technical advice to the administrator. The SAB was requested to review the CASTNet Ambient Air Monitoring Network. The board appointed a panel of experts to develop the initial advice, which is this panel. That advice is in draft form in the report provided on the public-facing website at sab.epa.gov under the activity for the CASTNet review. This report is to be discussed today. The meeting today is to deliberate upon the draft report and determine the consensus positions of the panel. Upon conclusion of the discussion, the panel will vote on to either 1, revise the report and meet again, or 2, revise the report and concur via email, or 3, accept the report as it stands. Upon acceptance or concurrence, The panel chair will convey the report to the full Chartered Science Advisory Board for a quality review. The report will be presented to the board by the chair and any representatives he may select to support him. Upon conclusion of the quality review, the board will vote on the report's dispensation and, if approved, the report shall be transmitted to the administrator by the chair of this panel and the chair of the Chartered SAB. I'd like to pause for a second and just ask if there's any questions about anything that I've said so far or where we are in the process. Okay, nothing heard from any of the panelists. I thank you for your efforts, and I look forward to continuing to support you as your designated federal official as you conclude this panel's work and in the preparation of the final report. I welcome Dr. Godfrey Uzochukwu, Chair of the EPA Science Advisory Board CASTNet Review Panel, and turn the conduct of the meeting over to him. Dr. Uzo.
Thank you, Dr. Bluma. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone.
They're all muted. Good afternoon.
Yes, unmute. Say hello. Well, let me join Dr. Bluma in welcoming you to today's meeting. And first of all, I have to thank all of you for the tremendous amount of work that you have put into drafting the report. And today we'll try to dive into the report and then, see what we can do with it. So again, I welcome all of you. So I would like to call the roll. So if you hear your name, just signal by saying present, either way. Let's begin with Dr. Florence Anoro. Okay, Douglas Barnes is now here. Dr. Olivia Clifton.
Here.
Okay, Mr. Dick Felton.
I'm here.
Dr. John Graham.
Present.
Ms. Lisa Lomfight.
Present.
Mr. Monaghan Ari.
Present.
Dr. Hutu Maro. Thought I saw her. Dr. Maro.
Yes, present.
Okay,
Well, present.
thank you.
Can you hear? Oh,
Yes, Dr. Sarah Nelson.
Present.
Dr. Ng Ngali.
here.
Dr. Gabriel Pfister.
Here.
Ms. Katie Pradell.
Here.
Dr. Stephanie Shah.
Here and unmuted.
Okay. And Dr. Godfrey Uzochukwu. I'm here. So this is the roll call. So the next thing we want to look at is the agenda for today's meeting. And we, at 3:45, we will have pre-registered public comments. Then at 4, there will be a discussion of report recommendations. At 5, we shall have a short break, well, 15 minutes. Then at 5:15, there will be a review or recommendation, chair assignments. This will be all panelists. 5:30, there will be agency clarifying questions. Dr. Richard Hobro. Then 5:35, there will be a discussion letter to the administrator. This will be all panelists involved. And then at 5:50, next steps, Dr. Bluma and myself. And at 6 p.m., we'll adjourn. So we have to be mindful of time and keep our comments short as it can be. So I will turn it over to Dr. Bluma for registered public comments.
So thank you. And just to let everyone know, there were no requests. Actually, there was one request for a public comment, which was withdrawn yesterday. So we have no current request for public comments. So we can proceed forward with the substance of the agenda.
Okay. Okay, the next thing we want to dive into will be the discussion of report recommendations. But before we do that, I'd like to share something.
Are you waiting for me to display that?
Yes, I want to make sure, you know how Zoom does sometimes.
But if you want, I can share that for you.
Yeah, share that for me, the discussion, the PowerPoint.
Okay. Great. Can you see that?
Oh, I got to share the screen. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so this is just some topics, something that will keep us focused on the meeting. Okay, next slide. Next slide, Brian.
It
Okay.
seems to be taking a second to roll over.
Yeah. Okay, this is more like some questions that you can ask yourself about the reports at this point, such as were the charge questions to the panel adequately addressed? Are there any technical errors, omissions, or issues that are not adequately dealt with in the draft report? Is the draft report clear and logical? Are the conclusions drawn or recommendations provided supported by the body of the draft report? And the board will select a subset of members to conduct the preliminary review and discuss the preliminary QR before voting on disposition of the report. Any recommendations for consideration of the current SAB members to the conduct of the preliminary QR? So these are just some things to be, we have to be thinking about. Next slide. Okay, Appendix A. Also, we will be discussing that. The ozone monitoring, aeroallergen monitoring, filter parks, chemicals, instruments, and methods, and citing other recommendations panel members want to discuss, and then items to consider for letter to administrator. Yeah, that it, Brian?
Well, it might be worth sort of pausing there and seeing if any of the panelists have questions or you want to
Yes.
ask about that.
Are there any questions or some more things to add?
I don't see any hands raised, so I think we can move on to start discussion of the first topic. If you're ready.
Yes, the Appendix A. In Appendix A, are the instructions clear what is the panel's intention for use and interpretation of the appendix? And then we'll keep the preliminary draft table. If so, is this clearly explained, or how to interpret and how different from the following table? And include an example of how to use the appendix and tables. Then applies to individual sites, chemicals, and groups of sites up to and including the network as a whole. Who volunteers to revise and ensure consistent citation across the body of work, in this case, and then if group agrees, revisions are needed.
So, Uzo, as we were discussing, I think the idea was to use these questions to sort of initiate a discussion. I know there was a group of people who started working in earnest to develop that table and that appendix and put it together. And so I was just wondering if maybe one or more of you wanted to sort of give a brief overview of what you see there and any thoughts you might have if there's any revisions necessary. And, you know, maybe any discussion you want to have around any of these questions that were raised.
Well, this is Stephanie Shaw. I'm happy to start off some commentary. So this table evolved out of conversation during our in-person meeting in May about the diverse objectives of CASTNet and how the current design of the network adequately or doesn't adequately fulfill any one of those individual objectives. And so when we were thinking about potential changes to make, whether driven primarily by cost cuts or by technical needs, there was an inherent conflict because any given site or measurement may help meet one objective, or removing it would allow for better meeting of other objectives. So how do we consider all of these factors when we make decisions? So the initial goal was really to document what are the objectives of the network as defined right now and as defined in the charge questions by EPA's desire to move forward in the future. And then to talk about different metrics that might help determine if a particular site or measurement helps the network meet those objectives. So that was the original goal. And in the documentation for Appendix A, it does say that the table is not meant to be prescriptive, but illustrative. So depending on the question being asked, the table might need to be modified in the future. But the idea was to first look at the objectives, determine which objective a particular action may help meet or not meet, and then weigh those factors into the decision-making process. So that's a bit of context. Anyone else that worked on that with me want to clarify or add?
I think you captured it well. And just a reminder of who that group was, it was myself, Stephanie, and John, who kind of originally proposed it. And I think it has evolved a lot in how it currently stands in its final version. I think Stephanie did a really good job of capturing what the first part of the table is. And I kind of went through this review process to try to apply it to just any type of monitoring network to see how the numbered bottom half of the table would work with the objectives. And I would propose we kind of get that group back together to work a little bit more on the second half, where we actually put a value for each defined kind of goal of each objective, if that makes sense. But I was looking for the table and I could share my screen if that would help.
Yeah, this is Sarah, and I worked on the table as well when we were there. And I appreciated that both the original version that we sort of deliberated about and then subsequently maybe tidied up a bit, and this sort of more operational version were included. I think that's something we should retain both versions, because there are some different pieces in the first table versus the second version that includes the capability to sort of assign a score. So just a vote for keeping both versions in there.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Sorry, Sarah, I forgot.
No worries. It's been a while.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, as you agreed, both of those tables were significantly different. And they both had useful information, which I thought it was a good idea to keep them both all three ultimately in there. So yeah.
And you share the table?
I have to find it. Hold on. I have a lot of screens open.
Okay.
Yeah, I can pull it out.
I have the PowerPoint version, so whatever. Yeah, that's probably a better version.
So I guess what I'll ask the group is, given that initial intent and the two separate versions, the kind of more overview version, and then trying to actually apply that in an example with some sort of quantitative differences. Is there anybody here in the group that thinks that this should not move forward in roughly this way, but with improvements in clarity? Okay, thank you. Hearing none.
Yeah, and just to let everyone know, I can't actually see if you raise your hand when I'm screen sharing. So if
I have
speak up.
I have one comment. This is Olivia. And this is something I've been thinking about in the report too. For column 7, we have this like increased model bias or error if site is removed. And I'm thinking that would actually be a pretty hard metric, just the way that, data assimilation techniques are going and the way our models have been developed over the years. I'm not sure if this is actually a realistic way of evaluating whether a site should be, citing should be changed, I guess.
I guess would a better way to say that be like, would it be easily determined if the site is used to ground truth existing models?
Well, I think to some extent they all are used to ground truth. And so I think the question is like, yeah, how to quantify how much rely on one site versus another, which is just, I think, a difficult quantification. I don't know if any other modelers have any inputs, Gabby.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could do maybe some fairly easy analysis of doing a correlation with nearby sites and see if this site provides significantly different information on ozone, variable changes, diurnal cycles, seasonal cycles, year-to-year variations than any of the most closest nearby sites. And then I would say if this site is significantly different than anything else you have nearby, then it probably is important to help with model evaluation and model development. So that could be a more easily accessible metrics maybe. Then
Yeah, I
agree with you. Data assimilation is, you can't afford doing that for every single site. I mean, you could be a really interesting research project, but it's probably beyond the scope.
And just to be really clear, you were referring to an element in this first table in column 7 there?
Yeah, Brian, you're asking me, Olivia. It's column 7, and then the second possible metric to evaluate within that column. And it's also noted in the the text and just thinking more about it.
Yeah. So I think at this point, the goal is really to see if overall it captures the essence of what you guys are interested in. And then we're looking to empower a small team, like 1 or 2 people to really edit on your behalf. And, if that team
Okay,
is
sure.
like, Stephanie or Katie, there's somebody else who wanted to be involved.
So what I'm hearing is maybe a change in language from increased model bias, which is a somewhat of a technical term, to some language around, does this site have a particularly unique contribution? Right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, we'll work with that. And of course, you'll have the chance to provide some markup, I think, later on, if I understand the process.
Yeah, that's correct. So what we'll do is we'll gather all the edits that everybody does. We'll put them into a report, and then we'll, depending on how you vote at the end, we'll email that around for concurrence with everybody. So, yes, you will have a chance to edit. Did you want me to roll down to look at the second and third table here? I think one of the questions was to see if the instructions were clear, or if you wanted to develop an example of applying this. It sounds like Katie's been working on that. Is that something the group generally agrees she should further develop and include? Or?
Yeah, I think that this is John. I think that that's a useful, illustration, because sort of something that we put together, but the easiest way to demonstrate that a tool is useful is to show that it has use and utility. And if we can't do it ourselves, then it's kind of, it doesn't make sense that it's going to be helpful for someone else if we can't give a nice example. And I think that there are historical examples of other networks where these decision processes have been made. So we maybe can borrow from some of that work that's happened in the past, and to the extent that this network is similar to those previous networks and those processes, we can reinforce our approach here. And to the extent maybe it's different, maybe we can highlight why this is appropriate for this network specifically. But I personally haven't been involved in those previous network evaluations, but I think there may be some folks on this committee who have those insights. But
and I have been on some of those, and I'll provide a counterpoint, and that is, this is almost a roadmap to getting rid of a site, which I don't like, because I find it difficult to think of every possible use of the data. We haven't put on here things like, cross-state interpollution transport or something, where states might be depending on that for their next annual report or whatever, lawsuit, whatever it is. And we're not going to know about that until it's too late. We recommend closing a site, or the score is too low to maintain it, whatever that metric is. I'd rather provide the ideas of what we think is important for those sites, but not necessarily provide the scoring system to get rid of that site.
So one thing that you mentioned kind of goes back to the whole initiation of this table. So you mentioned, well, what if the data is used for cross-state, air transport? So that's not listed as, is that included? Let me rephrase that. Is that included in any of the objectives that are listed? Because one of the challenges I think that we have is that there's a lot of value to any given data point, maybe beyond what its original intention was. But that's where it becomes tricky to make these priority decisions. Right. And so if cross-state should be in the objectives, or other things should be in the objectives, then perhaps we should modify the table to add it. Otherwise, if they're not in the stated objectives, current or future of the network, should it be considered? Right. I'm not saying that anyone is right or wrong. I'm just saying that if we're going to be looking at all the potential uses of the data, there could be very valuable R&D use of the data that doesn't fit into the regulatory design and purpose of the network. And so should that be a priority, or is that a great benefit if we can make it happen? If it can happen, but if it doesn't happen, it's not considered a detriment. So I think we have to make sure we distinguish between research kind of objectives or outcomes versus the design of the network. And that's I think our biggest challenge to this entire effort.
Right. I think it's kind of, that's a good point. I think it's beyond the scope of this review panel to include additional objectives for the existing CASTNet system, right?
Yeah, and CASTNet will update its documentation for future review, and they can of course modify this table, having been presented the method to add objectives as they evolve. Well, that actually covers pretty much all of the questions that I saw here. We got volunteers. And so the question is whether or not there's any last thoughts about the appendix. Otherwise, it sounds like Stephanie and Katie are empowered by the group to move forward with the draft that'll be reviewed, depending on how the group votes at the end in concurrence phase.
Hopefully John and Sarah can rejoin us as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to help out to the extent I can provide anything useful. Sure.
Yeah, same here.
All right, so John, Sarah, Katie, and Stephanie to revise, and we will include in the revised draft for concurrence, depending on how the group votes at the end. Thank you. All right, are we ready to move on to the next one, Uzo? You're speaking, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was working on people who have glitches logging in, but I think that's resolved now. Dr. Naru is in. Yeah. Let
Yes,
me.
I'm in by using my phone. Sorry.
Yeah. I want to make one comment about the appendix and the table. This thing here is not something that is something that we have to say is a finished product. So there has to be some room for additional work in the future. But the important thing is for us to show what the appendix is supposed to do, and then how to use it and make sure it can be used. But there's always room for improvement. We can get other teams in the future, who can take it forward and add to it. So when we finalize it, we're not going to say that everything is finished, because nothing is ever finished.
Yeah, so just to be clear, it's not a prescriptive thing. It can be used and modified in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Did you want me to click forward to the ozone discussion?
Yes, Brian.
All right, so next topic. Did you want to introduce it, or you want me to?
Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, so as has been observed in the draft report, there were different teams that wrote different responses to different questions, and there were a number of recommendations related to ozone monitoring, which were not completely consistent across the report. So this group, I think it was suggested by more than one member, would like to discuss the ozone monitoring recommendations and then to think about the tiering. And what Uzo and I put on the slide was the tier 1 recommendations that are currently in the report. But there are other recommendations which we could pull up if you want to go through them all. And then hopefully we can find one or more volunteers, similar to how we did with Appendix A, to go through the whole report and make sure it's consistent and representative of what the group's consensus position is on behalf of the group. So did anybody want to start the discussion? I know there were a number of you who had thoughts and some input about it. There was Dr. Clifton and
Brian, Gabi here. I might be slow in understanding, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, these are all tier 1 recommendations, right? For the different charge questions.
yeah, these were the 3 that I pulled from across the report that were
Right.
recommended in tier 1. And we just need to make absolutely certain that the group agrees that these are all tier 1. And just as a reminder, you know, tier 1 were the recommendations that were the highest priority. Tier 2 recommendations strengthen the science over time, and tier 3 recommendations are to be pursued further in the future as resources allow.
So basically the question is, does anybody disagree that these are our tier 1 recommendations? Do I get that right?
I think that is correct.
Okay, got it.
And just to confirm, were there any mentions of ozone monitoring that were in tier 2 or tier 3 anywhere throughout the report?
Yes, there were. So
Yeah, I think it was there was a sensor mentioned in one section, but I don't know if I have a note of it.
yeah, and so in section 2.1 of the report, to replace the current generation of ozone monitors with newly purchased and updated monitors was a tier 2 recommendation. And you can see that the highest priority on the replacement extension of ozone monitors was put in tier 1 in question 2. In the response to question 2.2.
Right.
Well, if I remember correctly, I think in charge question number 1, they put the ozone monitor replacement in tier 2.
Yeah, actually, let me
I believe that's, yeah.
let me share this. This may help. Actually, can you see that? I mean, it might be a little small.
You can make it bigger.
You want me to zoom?
Yeah, a little bit, maybe in the middle. Yeah,
Yeah, this is helpful.
a little bit more. Okay, that's fine.
So Dr. Bloomer, this is Florence. My understanding is the tier 1 questions, when compared to the tier 2, especially with the ozone monitoring, it's a more expansive and inclusive recommendation. So rather than changing the old monitors with newer ones, this is recommending expansion so that there's equity in the distribution of monitors across all ethnic groups, and especially in the rural areas, and in this case, the tribal communities.
Yeah.
Is that my understanding?
Yeah, that's this recommendation specifically here, which was in section 2.4 of the report, you know, to expand the continuous monitors to new sites on tribal regions, strengthening the ability to address policy relevant questions like that.
Right. And I believe, if I remember again correctly, that is also one of the aims, is to address some of the gaps in places where there are no monitors to capture what's happening in terms of air quality in those areas.
Yeah, and that's also in that section 2.4 is the highest priority should be put on replacing or expanding the monitors, and especially in gaps where there's spatial coverage, such as the Western US.
So might I suggest that we consider separating the replacement/upgrade with the expansion? It's really 2 separate issues. And that was a theme throughout the whole report, that there are kind of those 2 foci. And I'm just looking here at the lists. If we just look at like replacement/upgrade, right? Failing equipment, that in row, can't really see the rows off to the left there. Maybe you could scooch just a touch to make it a little easier to direct people. But, you know, the first row there, which appears to be row 9,
You see that better?
A little bit, yeah. So row 9, replace the current generation with newly purchased and upgraded. But now I need to see that, yeah, is tier 2. Then row 24, replace the current generation with newly purchased and updated is 2, tier 2. So those are consistent. Then then row 32, after the network has been prioritized, ozone and site shelter infrastructure updated is 2. But then in row 37, replacement and expansion is considered tier 1, right? So I think most of the agreement is that upgrading was tier 2, except for that one entry. Now, because some of these are combined, we may want to ask the group if we all still agree with that. But you can see that the consistency among the replacement from what was written is actually mostly consistent. And if we separate that out from the expansion to additional sites, whether it's spatial coverage gaps or targeting different populations, we may have a different answer. It may be easier to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing it. Thank you. Go ahead, Gabby.
May I make a comment here? And so I think one challenge is that we provide the tier ranking for each charge question separately. Let's say for the charge question where we had the different options for, these are potential investments. Do you want to do aerologen measurements? Do you want to do black carbon measurements? Do you want to replace or upgrade or expand the ozone monitoring network? So here you provide a different tiering than if you have a different charge question, right? So the tiering was relative within a charge question and not in an absolute sense for the entire review. I think that's where I struggle a little bit.
But I also think that oh, sorry. No, I also think that the tier 1 and tier 2 seems to also look at prioritization of what's the most will benefit the most people in terms of recommendations. So, and I remember discussions about replacing the older generation of monitors with newer ones. It still doesn't address the fact that there are areas where they don't even have old monitors. And that is probably what I think was why the tier 1 was given to that particular statement or recommendation. Now, unless someone that's the way I read it, and that's the way I understood.
So that's the expansion is what you're talking about. Should be tier 1.
Right.
Let me just go back to your other comment about old monitors. And we actually say in 2.4.5 that they should consider a sensor or a cheaper version of an ozone instrument. And it wasn't that many years ago that CASTNet went out of their way to switch all other instruments to federal equivalent method to get away from data that were not absolutely comparable to the NACS. And I don't think that's a good idea to go back on that switch because it was very successful. When originally we talked about that, I thought it was just for the PM suggestion, PM 2.5. I don't think it works as well for ozone because of the whole calibration issues and putting out data that could be bad below or above the NACS could be a real possibility, which I don't think we want to go there or recommend that.
So you're saying that tier 1 is tier 1 ranking
or expansion.
Expansion, it's good where it is.
Yeah, it's fine. But as far as the equipment, we don't want to recommend a sub FEM quality instrument for ozone in particular. In fact, if we're looking to recommend a money saving option, we could say purchase the new instruments over 3 years because you have spares, you have training, you already know how to run the old one. It's a cost effective way to do it in a budget tight environment.
So I think Lisa Lonepipe had a comment or a question.
Yes,
sorry I haven't been able to be on these calls and conversations as much as I would have liked to. But I am wondering where it says expansion of continuous ozone monitors to new sites on tribal regions. What is a tribal region? Is that a specific EPA term? Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I believe the answer is yes. I mean, most states have, if they have one, they know exactly where it is. And they have their own budget, so.
And so what so we have federally recognized tribes. There are some state recognized tribes. There are other tribes that would consider that they live in a tribal region, although they aren't federally or state recognized. And so I'm not trying to muddy this up, but that might be something we want to at least consider. Maybe you want to say federal and state recognized tribes, unless you're talking about anybody who considers themselves a tribe, and there are quite a few out there actually, but they aren't state or federally recognized. They could be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
So what you are saying is, instead of saying tribal regions, you can say state or federal recognized tribes. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's most accurate, and will also keep us out of some political type things that people could say, well, it says region and we're a tribal region. We could qualify for that. Whereas the specific designation of federally recognized tribes and state recognized tribes is very specific.
Yeah, I believe it has more to do with actual territory, because some rules don't apply on an Indian reservation as opposed to a state managed property. There are different authorities as far as who has the right to monitor air or emissions. It's a whole different
Exactly.
thing.
That's why federally or state recognized tribes.
Yes,
That would,
but not just tribes, the area that they manage, if that makes sense.
no, it doesn't.
Okay. But I think it has more to do with territory or land as opposed to the, it's a different organizational structure for the land itself.
So I think I heard the proposal was to just be a little more clear and say state or federally recognized tribes, and to go with that in the report. The agency, of course, has an office that deals with tribal affairs, and so if any action we're going to be taking, they would be included in, appropriate consideration to the nation to nation relationship would be taken into account.
Yeah. And so if you all want to say regions, that's up to you. I'm just giving giving you all some information in terms of what I know and understand and working for my tribe, and then being also a member of my reservation, my tribe. And so it's just one of those things that it's normally said in most documents, especially most federal documents, because we are nation to nation. It's usually state and recognized tribes, and that really covers most all. And usually if we don't say that, there are other things that come up that could bog things down in a different way. Your document, you all have done a lot of work on it. It's just, that's my 2 cents, but thank you.
It's also going to be your document, so thank you. Sally, you have your hand up.
Yep, I have a quick question. I might miss this information in the document. So are all the current ozone monitors at all sites the same age, or there are certain sites with older monitors? So when it comes to this replacement, I wasn't sure it's like a tiered replacement system or all at once, because I wasn't sure what's the age of these monitors at all sites. I don't know if you have that information.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're different ages.
Yeah, they actually did go ahead and start the entire FEM program at the same time.
Okay.
So they're probably very close to the same age. They're on the call if we really need to ask that.
Yeah. So I guess like if we are replacing, then probably replacing all if they're around the same age.
Right. And it doesn't mean the data aren't still valid. It just means they're less reliable as they get older.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think the outstanding question is whether or not the group wants to harmonize the tier recommendations across the report so that a single recommendation is consistently tiered the same.
I would say yes, we need to do that, and it might be easier to split, again, the upgrades versus the expansion issue.
I agree.
I'm fine with that. I just want to still caution that sometimes maybe within one charge question, something might qualify as a tier 1 versus it in another charge question at tier 2. That, again, I still think it will be hard to be very consistent in that regard, since the charge questions are very, very different in parts.
Yeah, I think I agree with Gabby. And my approach would be, let's have the overall, based on all of the recommendations we make in each individual question, let's look at all of the priorities that we have and then give an overall priority rather than try to go back and reprioritize things within each individual question. Let's just give a final recommendation based on the 5 different questions and how we've weighted these things. Like if we have like priorities 1, 1, 2, 2, and 3, but it's a priority of some level in every question, that's probably a more important thing to be prioritizing overall versus something that is only a top priority in one question, but doesn't exist at all necessarily in some of the others. At least, I think to me that in the end, what we want to do is just have a final set of recommendations that borrow from each of the individual questions and then come with one, that final, here's our priority based on, that we've looked at things through different lenses at different, through the different charge questions, and then we come up with a final set. And I don't think that requires us to go back and reprioritize within each question necessarily.
Thanks, John. You explained it much better than I could.
I don't disagree philosophically, but practically, if you look at these ozone recommendations, there's only one that's not aligned. So we can use that approach for other issues that may be more diverse in priority across the report. So I would just say maybe we look at that one where ozone replacement and upgrade is not tier 2. Like I think 5 are tier 2, 1 is not. See if that needs adjustment and then move on.
So a question to Brian, is there going to be recommendations in the cover letter? Would that be the summary for this?
Well, so we don't typically include all the recommendations in the cover letter. What we'll do is discuss kind of like what your top 3 to 5 might be that you want to highlight. And it may not be totally a recommendation. It may just be sort of the affirmation about the value of the network and the importance of continuing it in some form. That may be the thing that this group really wants to elevate. And then maybe there's 1 or 2 recommendations after that you want to highlight. So it's open for discussion, and we can have that discussion later after we go through these different topic areas.
Okay.
And coming back to John's point, so after all these, I agree with that approach. But do we now, after all these charge questions, we also come up with a set of overall recommendations considering all the charge questions? Is that also a task, or I guess this may be a question for Brian? Like, is that something we also need to do in this report as an overall set considering all the charge questions?
No, it's totally up to you. I mean, you could actually put the overall recommendations up front in the introduction to the report, and then the more detailed stuff flows after that. That's been done in other reviews in the past, so totally wide open to you guys, whatever you wanted to do. Okay, so I guess right now we're looking for some volunteers to step up and just go through the ozone material, make sure that we're consistent across all the aspects of the report from front to finish before we send it out for final concurrence. So do we have a volunteer?
I'm happy to volunteer.
Thank you so much. And did anybody want to be a second or help out?
I'm happy to help with it.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So Gabby and Olivia, you guys can work on behalf of the group. And if anybody's got any additional input, they can, of course, email it to you and me.
Yeah,
directly.
and Brian, would you be able to share that Excel spreadsheet that you showed?
Yeah, I'm gonna send that out to everybody.
Okay,
I didn't
good.
know if we were actually gonna use it, so I will send it to you. I sent you an early version of it when the report was in draft, which you may or may not remember and still have. But I've updated it with the final as you guys went final. All right. I think my screen share stopped. Do you want me to go back to the slides? Uzo, you may be.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we finished the ozone monitoring and we've got a team to work on that. So the next big discussion was about the aero allergens monitoring. So, did you want to start that discussion, Uzo?
Yes, I just want to this aero allergen. I don't know if it's in the domain of EPA or NIH, because when you look at all kinds of things that are associated with allergy, not just one factor, is multiple factors. Some of them are air, some of them are water, and all kinds of things. So I don't know if we'll have to dive into this, and if we do, how deep. So somebody has to help and see which way we would go on this.
Yeah, so I think what we did was we captured, there were a couple of different camps related to this, and there's these sort of outstanding questions, which, at least one of them is mentioned here. And so if we felt like the group needed to get together and come to like a consensus position on this. And so the discussion is whether or not the recommendation that CASTNet not do air allergen monitoring is really the consensus position of the group. And then, maybe just make sure that that's consistently represented in the report. So, Dirk.
It struck me that in years past, the EPA had a monitoring and methods subcommittee, or SAB, I guess, had that committee. And this wouldn't have been thrown at a committee like this. It would have been discussed on its own merit beforehand to see if it was a valid method going forward. And if, the data was worthwhile, the method was worthwhile, the company that owns the technique is trustworthy and that sort of thing. And it seems difficult to throw that on this committee without having, a lot of work done ahead of time to really make sure it's a worthwhile thing to proceed with. I don't know if it's possible to make a recommendation to start a new committee in this proceeding.
Yeah, well, you can certainly discuss the things that were done in the past, and you can say that that's a best practice that you would recommend engaging in the future before they invest money in actually doing it. I mean, that's totally within your purview. Yeah. Anything else, Dirk?
No, I'm just not. There's just too many unknowns for me to really want to support this.
Yeah. Okay, Gabby.
Yeah, and I think I just want to support it. I think from all the discussions why we put that first question into the document was that nobody on the committee was really sure if EPA is really responsible for doing the air allergen measurements. And why it also didn't stick out as this, yes, we need to jump on it, is that it's really not seen as a complementary measurement, but rather an add-on measurement to a current network. Now, if you tell us you have billions of billions to spend, I would say, sure, why not? But if you say there is limited budget, then it's kind of, well, we don't know enough about it. We don't see a huge benefit for the current suite of measurements. So it didn't seem to rank that high, but like Dirk also said, we don't really have the expertise or the full knowledge to judge that.
All right.
Ari?
Oh yeah, I mean, I totally understand that, and that's again, I'm not the person to answer the question, right? Is this in the domain of the EPA? Me coming from the CDC, I think it is definitely air allergens have a definite public health burden, but there are a lot of questions. I mean, I've been doing some pollen research with the existing network with the National Allergy Bureau. But I don't think those current monitoring methods and this new pollen monitoring instrument, yeah, there's a lot of questions. Can it be scaled up? Is it actually a really good representative pollen measurement? So, I mean, I kind of agree with all the recommendations that we have here, that we put it forth in the document. Unfortunately, you're right. If we had millions of dollars to spend, yeah, let's do it. Let's expansion of pollen measurements throughout the country and in underserved areas. But looking at if we had to prioritize, you're right. I mean, it's kind of an unknown measurement system, so maybe we should focus on other things. So, I mean, I'm very sad to kind of let this go, but realizing, hey, what else is out there, and does this fit into the existing CASTNet system, which I don't believe it does, right? So,
Thanks for that. Are there any other comments in this area? Otherwise, it sounds like there's a consensus position emerging. So it sounds like, if I can summarize, it sounds like the consensus position is to say that it should not be done by CASTNet at this time. However, given the questions about the methods and whether it's even in the domain of EPA, it should be reconsidered and brought in the future to a committee that's designed to evaluate specifically the methods and the monitoring needs for that objective.
yeah, I like that idea, and I'm not familiar with that committee to assess the needs assessment. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. So I'm going to be looking for a volunteer to sort of make sure that gets captured and is consistent across the report. So Dirk, I don't know if you wanted to volunteer for that since you articulated it so well.
Sure, I'll do that one.
Thank you.
And Dirk, I could help you as well.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the next one's a more extensive one if you look at the topic areas. So this one kind of requires the spreadsheet. So I'll go back to that. And it's like more than a page. So this is kind of like the large questions that are related to all of the other monitoring considerations that the network's designed to address and has historically been doing. So like the filter pack discussions, the addition of passive ammonia discussion, the sampling frequency discussion. Most of these recommendations, I think, ultimately sort of get ranked and prioritized and graded relative to the application of the Appendix A. So I don't know if people wanted to start the discussion there, or if Hui Ting maybe wanted to, or Sally, or maybe somebody who's worked a lot in this area and thought about the monitoring capabilities and the future requirements, wants to sort of put an overall overlay so that we can think about this as we're discussing going forward.
Maybe I'll jump in for a quick comment. So when I was reading it, like we mentioned about modern technology and online measurements, I think throughout here and there in the report. And one thing that, I want to make sure within ourselves is that we are consistent of what we consider as, online modern technology. So like ozone and NOx monitor, these are online, technology, modern technology, but I would not consider state of the art. They have been around for quite a long time. And so like when I was considering these really, state of the art technology, I was thinking of technology that can measure PM speciation in real time. So measuring organics, nitrates, sulfate, and ammonium. So that is what, I consider as, state of the art technology. So I think maybe that is one thing that we can, harmonize among ourselves, is that in terms of when I was reading the report, is that what do we think of as these online technology? And because later I also read about high temporal resolution. So high temporal resolution from my perspective is also online technology, but they are in different tiers. So that is maybe something that, I would like to hear inputs from everyone in terms of, shall we try to, be coherent in terms of how we categorize these different technologies?
That's interesting because I actually was thinking the opposite in terms of a CSN at the rural NCORE sites, which are 24-hour measurements. But because they're a different size fraction, I think they're useful to be co-located. So I hate to say it, only high temporal, very, very expensive methods would be acceptable when having almost any co-located valid information would be potentially useful for someone.
Yeah, so maybe we can define the temporal resolution in, I guess, more precisely, right? Because I think high temporal resolution means different things for different people. For me, I consider it seconds, minutes as high temporal resolution, but maybe hours or 24 hours is already high enough, in terms
right.
of
24 hours higher than 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. But
Right.
I would not consider 24 hours as high resolution,
Okay,
from my perspective, right? So that's why I think it would be good to kind of maybe do a little bit calibration among ourselves so that we are talking about the same thing.
So there were a number of these recommendations that I think, are sort of in general agreement, which was to consider the continuing the biweekly filter pack sampling, but to analyze and consider changing the sampling frequency if cost savings were necessary. And then to continue the monitoring of the ambient species that CASTNet has at its core mission, the sulfur and nitrogen species related to acid deposition. And then, we already talked about ozone, but, continuing that as the new instrumentation, especially the remote sensing instruments, come online over the next decade. And then considering some of the aerosol composition, and then possible expansion into like the PFAS or other chemicals in communities of emerging concern. Again, I can't really see if you're raising your hand when I'm sharing the screen, so you'll just have to speak up.
Hi, Brian. This is Huiting. I'll just add a couple of comments to what other panelists already said. I mean, I agree actually with Sally regarding using the high temporal resolution measurements for ion concentrations. But it's very expensive. So it doesn't seem like we are reducing the budget. We're helping EPA to reduce the budget. So I'm wondering, like, if we should add some text about, running such high resolution measurements at a number of locations that can capture the influence of, for instance, wildfires, stuff like that. But also, I believe Sally's network already had some sites, right, Sally?
Yeah, so we have 3. So the Ascent network with these, really high, temporal resolution speciation measurements. So 3 of the sites on CASTNet, the 3 national parks Joshua Tree, Yellowstone, and also Great Smoky Mountains. So we have some text in the report in terms of using these 3 sites, maybe as a test exercise to see, the amount of data we can actually gain from these real-time measurements. Because in the other charge question, we are being asked, oh, shall we measure black carbon? Shall we measure wildfire tracers? But these state-of-the-art instruments can measure everything all at once, so you don't need to choose, right? So coming back to charge question number 5, the other measurement ideas, maybe that is question for Brian. So in this charge question, we are not limited by budget. There are other measurement ideas we can dream and think about what we would actually like to do in the future. Is that correct? Or this charge question is still limited by budget?
Yeah, so this panel is charged with the scientific and technical considerations relative to the objectives. And so although the reality is that we are budget constrained, so you have to be reasonable. You can't just do total pie in the sky. For example, the recommendation, which I think actually comes under the siting considerations, is to maintain those 3 sites that are co-located that you just mentioned with the new and emerging technologies as a priority. Is one of the recommendations of this group. And then I think this one was dealing with more thinking about, given the programmatic needs and the unique role that it fills scientifically, but also in terms of our understanding of the processes that are emerging, such as climate change and climate change's impact on these ecosystems and the air pollution chemistry. What would be the highest priorities, or what new measurements should be considered as the highest priority for consideration as the network evolves. And again, it would be basically informing an application of Appendix A in the consideration of a new measurement or a new technology for a measurement relative to the other priorities that they have to meet and the amount of available budget that they have in any particular year.
I'd like to add another comment is on reducing the frequency of field packs. I'm wondering if we should add some text on treating sites. It really should be site specific when it comes to reducing the frequency of field packs. For instance, I'll just give you an example. So if we want to really monitor how agricultural activity impacts, aerosol chemical compositions, then it's okay. It may be okay to use bi-weekly field packs, right? But if you're looking at, for instance, the impact of volcanic events or wildfires, then you definitely need high frequency measurements. So I guess the Appendix A can also be used for considering, the frequency of field packs.
Yeah, and you did make a recommendation that they should do modeling to look at the impact of these changes before a change actually gets implemented.
Yes, yeah, that also.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said, this is probably one of the more complicated ones because it covers such a wide number of variables. It's chemicals, frequency of collection, instrumentation, and methods. And I know Yu-Ting and Sally and others sort of dug into this, and it's one of the longer discussions in the report itself. And I don't know, it's, hopefully everybody had a chance to go through it in advance of this call and was able to think about what might be your questions or what you might want to discuss, or perhaps it's fine just the way it is. And, perhaps these recommendations and their tiering are fine just the way they are. But if there were some adjustments that needed to be made, or if there was some discussion that needed to be had to determine what those adjustments should be, this is the place where we need to have that discussion.
Yeah, so I have this question about the charge question 5, in terms of when we talk about, I don't know if this is the time to talk about tier yet, but in tier 1, we recommend online instrumentation. And then on tier 2, we recommend higher temporal resolution instruments. And so I wasn't sure what's the difference between that, but that is more of a clarification, thing we can do in terms of better defining, what we consider as online versus, high temporal resolution instruments.
Right. So those are the kinds of questions. That's the thing, because there were different writing teams, to some extent, who provided some input here. And so what we need to do is just make sure that things are consistent across that. And so maybe if you were interested in maybe just going through and doing a quick edit, maybe the group would be comfortable with that level of engagement on this one before we take it final.
Yeah, so I went through that once, but I'm happy to take a look again at the latest version. I was mostly focusing a lot of the state-of-the-art instrumentation, in terms of complementing, for the current filter pack and what we can potentially do in the future. But I'll be happy to take a look at this again, but I'll be happy to have more volunteers since this is a big task.
Yeah, and you can also use this spreadsheet to kind of help make sure you're harmonizing the recommendation and the text of those recommendations as you revise.
This is Waiting. Sally, I just want to, sort of address your question a little bit. When I was synthesizing all the responses to the charter question number 5, I guess that involves two aspects. Yes, we do need to modernize the network, but as you and I, we were talking about, it's really expensive to employ the kind of instrumentation you have for Ascent. So it is almost impossible to deploy that kind of instrumentation network-wide, you see. So I wonder, if actually that was a thought behind putting that into tier number 2.
Yeah, and then for the online, in terms of the tier 1, they say there's a, the text would say highest priority should be put on modernizing CASTNet with online instruments and state of the art. So
yes, so I believe it's really a matter of language. So maybe I can help you out if you want to, take the lead on that.
Yeah, that would be great. My current thinking is that, we have these 3 sites on CASTNet and Ascent that we can use really as a poster child, to see how it works and how much information we can gain with really these state-of-the-art instruments. And, we have data that we can compare in the future and really build a case, maybe, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, that, we can really, have the resources to really modernize. Maybe we don't do filter packs anymore, going forward, because the technology is available to do these measurements, much more frequent than doing filter packs. And I think this is actually, one question I also put out there, maybe there will be a room for some sort of cost assessment. So these technologies are expensive, quote unquote, at the start, but they don't have much maintenance, right? So filter packs might be cheaper, but it's a continuous labor, continuous, work. So, I actually do not know, I don't think nobody has done this, some sort of economic assessment to see, how much, in terms of, doing filter packs and hiring people, taking the filter, analyzing the filter in the lab and then reporting the data, and versus, buying these state-of-the-art instruments. And that's just one capital cost, upfront. So maybe at some point in time in the future, there could be room for EPA to do this exercise. And when it comes to the budget and costs.
Yeah, so that's like a total integrated cost over, X number of years recommendation. Yeah.
I'm completely with you on this one. Actually, that was in my original response to charter question number 3. I had quite a bit of discussion on that as well. So I'm completely with you on that. The way I see it, it really is a matter of the questions we should ask. In addition to leveraging Ascent's 3 current sites, do we need more sites? I think that's one question to ask. And the second question is, maybe that is an aspiration, to modernize the entire network in the future. So that will be probably in the time frame of a decade and not just, a couple of years. Really depends on the budget of the EPA's network.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think not just CASTNet, pretty much everything that is done on the filters, right? So
I agree.
We really need to modernize, these filters have been around for decades and now new technology available. Yeah.
Yeah, and so just as a reminder, that would be a tier 3 recommendation. So those things to pursue for the future as resources allow. Yeah. And, I think it's important because, arguing and laying the groundwork for that kind of transformation over the timescale of a decade is, something that's good for this panel because you can see that far, to recommend to help the managers start to lay out those plans and do what they need to do if they're going to pursue it over time.
Yeah. So I would say maybe tier 1 will be to make sure we maintain these 3 sites that are co-located with Ascend. So don't get rid of those 3 sites. And then tier 2 and 3 to look forward to the future that we truly modernize these measurement monitoring networks.
Yeah, and under this question, it's really more about the chemicals to measure and the instruments and the methods to use. And so, there's still the big question about ammonia monitoring and, which kind of method you might recommend for that. And then there was another consideration about MET measurements. So we just need to make sure that the group's sort of consistent with whatever you would recommend in that area.
So I forgot which one was the charge question for the like in the response about ammonium and ammonia, but there are some text written about ammonia and ammonium.
Yeah, so in section 2.4 of the report, it's charge question 4. And then it was also mentioned under charge question 1 and in charge question later, where they were talking about the future. So yeah, I think those are the main places where I captured where I was talking about charge questions 1 and charge question 4 for ammonia. All right, any other thoughts, questions, or comments on chemicals, methods, instrumentation?
I think, Brian, the panel, I'm thinking maybe to narrow down the recommendations, because there's a lot of things on it. All of them are important, but I don't know if we have to put list everything that is listed already. I think if we bottom it down to maybe 5 or 6, somewhere there, maybe combine some things too where necessary.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Sally and Hui-Ting, when you're looking at that, if there's like repetition across charge questions, maybe there's a way to eliminate some of that repetition if it's not necessary. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, sure. And I see that like PM 2.5 measurement has been kind of mentioned in several charge questions and tiers.
Yeah. Okay. So good. Thank you so much. I think this is super helpful, and it sounds like the group's in agreement and empowering you, and we'll get a chance, depending on how they vote at the end, to review it again before final concurrence. All right, the next topic is the siting considerations. So this one will exactly talk about the maintaining the 3 sites that we've just talked about. So this one may go very, very quickly. So these are the charge questions, the tier for the recommendation, the report section that it's in, and then what the actual recommendation is. So as you can see, it starts out with the closing the geographic gap, the co-located, continue to use CASTNet sites for co-located measurements. And that recommendation, the text of it may want to be modified to really clearly reflect the discussion you all had about making sure that the CASTNet sites remain available because its infrastructure is so valuable to researchers and others who can use it. I know, Katie, you had some really good observations about that at the May meeting.
I can edit that if you want. I think like our discussion, I was just going to say during our discussion on the last topic and this one really highlights that maybe that's in my mind the biggest value of CASTNet is that the infrastructure and that it's available to researchers and state, local, tribal agencies to use along with their networks and like the long-term trends that are available there. So I think that that's kind of rising to the top through all these discussions, the breadth of filter or data available on the last filtered spreadsheet kind of indicates how valuable it is, I think. So yeah, but I would be happy to edit that one.
Awesome. So are there any other thoughts or discussions about these that anybody wants to make sure gets included in the consideration as she goes forward with that? Or... I know Doug Burns may have had a few thoughts, and he was unfortunately not able to be here today, so maybe we can touch base with him as well.
Yep, I can pull him in. I work with him a lot.
Yeah.
Well, panelists is getting to 5 o'clock when we need to take a break. And we'll be back again at 5:15. It's almost 2 minutes to 5. Right? Unless there are other questions, anything pressing.
All right. Nothing heard. It sounds like we're going to take a break, and we'll see everybody back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Bluma.
Hello, Uzo. Welcome back.
Thank you for the great job that you are doing. And thank you for how things are moving smoothly.
So I'm happy to help support you in that way. Absolutely.
Yeah, tremendous support, not tremendous support. I appreciate.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All right, it's 5:14, so we'll be starting again in about a minute. It's good to see everybody popping back on. Thank you for those who leave your cameras on. That really helps me. So I appreciate that.
And Tom Brennan is also here. We haven't seen him or heard from him. Hi, Mr. Brennan, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here. I think the meeting's going really well. Thanks to Brian and you for your leadership. And I'm listening intently.
Thank you. We appreciate you always. Okay, folks, it's almost half a minute, 30 seconds. So we can hop in and get it done by 6, not at 6, but by 6.
Yeah, so actually, we've sort of covered the review of recommendations and chair assignments. There was just, I believe, one more topic area that we could cover to see if there was anything that we had missed that the group wants to focus on or discuss before we move on to discussing the top 3 items you want to make sure are in the letter to the administrator.
We're going to go back to the Excel.
I was not, but I can. Share the screen. And you can let me know when you see it.
Yes.
So these are the recommendations that were grouped in the other category. So I don't know if everybody can read them. But it's a pretty wide variety of things related to a number of areas, such as the bibliography, maintaining the bibliography, which I think the group discussed and was quite appreciative of, seeing that as a best practice for the industry. Some recommendations for continued integration and cooperation with other network programs. And then some kind of data management recommendations, and then the expansion for EJ considerations was highlighted specifically within this area. And then there was a broad recommendation for increasing training and technical assistance to tribal nations and overburdened communities. That is probably more than just CASTNet. It's probably a recommendation for EPA writ large, and not just for CASTNet, but for other monitoring networks and other air quality programs as well. So, are there any other items to discuss, or any of these that the group wants to talk about, either the category or the tiering? Or
I had a quick question about the bibliography of network-based publications. I mean, would maintaining a DOI for the data be better here? Because then you could look up, what papers had cited the DOI, and instead of like a manual bibliography.
Yeah, I don't think that's like a data field to add to the bibliography as it already exists, right?
Right. Yeah. And I just think it would be a little more adaptable, but I'm not up on the latest in terms of these types of things.
Yeah, so it would be easy to edit that and or include it as a tier 3 recommendation.
On a separate topic, I'm just noting row 44, deployment of low-cost sensors accompanied by visualization and interpretation is a tier 1. So just make sure that that is actually included along with the recommendations that I think Sally was going to take the first stab at in terms of measurements. So it's listed as other. I'm not sure if it really counts as other, and that's because of the placement in the DACs and the tribal regions, or if it's there because of, I'm not sure why it's classified that way.
Well, we can switch it into the other one that Sally and everything we're going to take care of if you like.
Yeah, like I'm seeing in the report there are some tier 3 recommendations for low-cost sensors, so maybe that also needs to be synchronized.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move that one into the category topic that you're working on, the FPCIM topic. Any other thoughts or comments about this list?
Yeah, I just wanted to, on the first one, we do mention somewhere that the data should be provided in parts per billion as well as micrograms per cubic meter. And that would help with folks integrating with federal, state, and local air quality monitoring programs. That's the first item. It's just mentioned in parentheses. I forget where exactly, but I think it should be emphasized because that's how the states provide their data. So it would make it much more consistent. And it's not easy to get that and change it later on.
So you're saying the item on line 7?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to emphasize that CASTNet should provide gaseous data in parts per billion, as well as micrograms per cubic meter.
Just sort of ignoring they don't have the MET measurements to actually do that accurately.
It's not easy to get. Exactly.
I understand.
And you need pressure too, because some of these are high altitude.
Exactly. Yeah. Can vary quite a bit from site to site.
Yeah.
All right. Any other observations, comments, or items to discuss on this list? So we moved one item into the consideration with the others, and then Dirk, you had one that you wanted to make sure was worded a particular way. You willing to just take that one on and make sure it reflects what you had intended there?
Yeah, the parts per billion comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then is the group good with this at this point with those minor edits?
Yes.
All right. Well, then we can move on, Uzo. So the next item would be to discuss the letter to the administrator. And so the idea here is that across all of the recommendations that are being made in the report, probably, like the 3 to probably at most 5 most important things that you would want to convey to the administrator should be elevated. And so I believe you probably want to have some discussion about what those 3 to 5 things are and come to some agreement.
This is Stephanie. I'll propose the first. It was very consensus agreement that CASTNet was a high value network, particularly for certain unique features like information on deposition and long-term trends. So might I suggest that that be a key recommendation, perhaps with some expansion around the comments that were already in the document around, having a goal of ideally maintaining or increasing funding rather than dropping it.
Any disagreement with that, or anybody want to discuss that? Okay, nothing heard, so it sounds like unanimous consent.
I want to have a comment to make. So based on what was said, does it mean that all the sites will be maintained, none to be dropped?
That was not the intent of my statement. The first of the charge questions was, has CASTNet, done its job? And our answer was essentially, yes, it has. So I guess I want to just emphasize that, we all agreed strongly that there was high value to what's been done. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to change in the future, right? And whether that's due to external drivers like budget or internal drivers like reprioritizing funding. But, that statement, we could mention in there what was particularly valuable to try to narrow that down.
Yep.
Thank you.
So it sounds like everybody's generally in agreement with that. And Stephanie, are you willing to take a stab at that statement to include in the letter?
Sure.
All right. So I know there's already some text in there, so you might want to look at again at what's already there and just edit that. Are there other things that the group wants to elevate? There was a number of things we discussed today, about the ozone monitoring, about modernizing, about maintaining the co-located sites for the new and evolving technology that's being deployed. There's discussion at the May meeting and in the report, some extensive discussion about the value of the network over the next decade for supporting the deployment of the satellite and other remote sensing technologies. So are there any of those topics that you want to propose elevating into the top 3? Olivia? I saw you went off mute. Did you want to say?
Yeah, well, there is something I wanted to discuss briefly, but it's not top 3 related. So that's why I held my comment.
Okay.
I would like to maybe advocate for making sure we maintain the 3 sites that are co-located with Ascent to really leverage the Ascent modern technology in terms of aspire for the future. I felt like, yes, there's budget constraints, but we need to look forward to the future. So I would really like to, advocate for that, within the budget constraints, we do what we need to do, but using these 3 sites as an example and demonstration for what can be done actually in the future. Not actually, we can do it now, just there's no money, but if in the future there's budget, this is something we can do in terms of really real-time online measurement of pretty much everything without, having to, do offline analysis, afterwards. So at least those 3 sites, I think, should be maintained under whatever circumstances, I think.
Yeah, and you discussed in the report and at the last meeting about having those overlap between the technologies so we can maintain those long-term trends, as that being super critical as well. So that's probably something worth mentioning. Sort of expanding beyond just those 3 sites, the concept of sentinel sites or geographic areas that are of particular concern. There was a public commenter talking about the Adirondacks region and how it's a critical receptor and how they're seeing the recovery. And they're right at the sort of in the middle of watching these changes that are resulting from the implementation of the policy. And so is there something about sort of actually following through in some of these critical areas, to see how the policy is playing out over time, or maybe even maintaining that into the period where you're starting to be able to evaluate climate impacts as well? Is there certain geographic areas or things that you would elevate potentially to maintain at the level of these sort of top 3 recommendations going forward?
They certainly could go into the first bullet that the network is valuable and this is why. Having those trends for the Adirondacks is incredibly important. And, the irony was Brook Trout Lake didn't have any brook trout in it until just recently. So, things are improving, but it's going to take a really, really long time. And this data is really showing the improvements over time. But I'm also going to agree that there are faults with the methods. You know, the filter packs lose volatile species. So having the co-location with the new methods is the key to the long-term future. So I can see having both of those things, you know, as within the top 3 recommendations.
So are the top 3 then maybe like the importance of the network, which is what Stephanie's working on, kind of a suggestion of geographic coverage relative to the goals, the future strategic plan for EPA. So geographic coverage to track long-term trends as well as develop, improve and enhance modeling for EJ areas. And then the third might be modernization of the network. So in that, you could say keeping ascent would be important as a model for future advancements of the CASTNet network.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah.
And that would also allow for inclusion of the ozone upgrade and maintenance of the ozone network site numbers.
Yeah, and the modernization part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Katie, can you repeat what you said about EJ communities?
I think I see like the 3 highest priorities or most useful areas of the network based on the discussions that we've had is that like number 1 is the long-term trends and the spatial distribution of the sites nationally and how they provide a resource to researchers and modelers as well as state, local, tribals. Number 2 would be, getting a little bit more specific about geographic coverage and what the goals of EPA are, future goals in their strategic plan, which is to track climate change and EJ and help EJ areas, which is a shift from historic goals. So this network is good for those, but it should be adjusted a little bit to accommodate that. So like the Adirondacks would be important for tracking climate change, but it might be important to provide coverage in on tribal lands and potentially in the Midwest more. So that was kind of sprinkled throughout the report. And then finally, modernization of the network. So, the network is important. So let's invest in it with anything we have now, invest in what we have, and then keep the ascent sites in order to use as a model for future improvements.
Okay, thank you.
And when you were thinking about the chemicals in the future, I know there's a emerging literature about the importance of ammonia, and you talked about the Midwest. Did the group want to elevate considerations of ammonia? Because I know there were, I believe in the past, there were more AMON sites and a bunch of them got shut down when the budget decreased. Is that something you guys have a recommendation about? And does that recommendation rise to the level of the letter to the administrator?
I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. We personally in Wisconsin, we removed our network, our AMON network, because it was operationally expensive but if there was a different method that would be probably appealing to state and locals in the Midwest, because ammonia is a big component of PM 2.5 in our speciated PM 2.5 network.
Yeah, part of what we're doing is providing data that will be used in the future. And when the PM NAX is likely to be lowered, there will be a lot more interest in that data. So having longer term trends is going to be valuable going forward.
So is this something similar to like what you were talking about before, where it might be there needs to be a recommendation to like a monitoring and methods committee to really sort of evaluate on a number of different methods and the costing of that and the data quality from each of those before.
Well, the
Bring it
AMON
back.
it's a sampling, it's not an analysis technique. So it's less expensive for the field, but there's more cost in the lab. And, you know, CASTNet in the past hasn't had a lot of technical folks in the field. So it changes the dynamic of how you run a monitoring site, whether it's sampling or whether it's analyzing. And AMON is strictly sampling. So there are ammonia analyzers out there, but they're not easy to run, and they've got a lot of issues. So I don't know if just for sampling, I don't think you need to go there. But if you decide we want to have a continuous method, then yes, we would need a sort of outside help with looking at what the most appropriate method is.
So yeah, so the method, but if you're just focusing on the existing sampling method, you know, is it important enough that you would recommend or elevate recommending that it be brought back or re-implemented?
I think it's very important, and you know, we certainly are running ours because we see this as something the state's going to need, and other states probably as well, when the levels come down, when the next levels come down, because then you're much more interested in what the components are to look at which control options are viable for your state.
No, like Sarah or John or
Yeah, the modelers might have an
yeah.
opinion on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think that ammonia is a critical thing to be measuring, and just like the NACs going down and it becoming more of an important thing to track from a regulatory standpoint, I think there's a move as ammonia becoming an energy carrier in our system as we move away from carbon. And so if ammonia becomes a fuel for, you know, big trucks, it could be, I mean, I think they're thinking more from an ocean vessel standpoint, but it could be that, well, we're going to have more sources of ammonia too, which could lead to more leaks and more ammonia in the atmosphere. So I think having sentinels out there that actually measure that pollutant will be really critical. And there's other studies too that show that that it's also one of the more sensitive components of the PM mix. And so from a cost-effective standpoint, that's a cost-effective way to eliminate, because if you remove the ammonia, it doesn't bind. There's nothing to bind with it if you remove the nitric acid and the ammonia from the system. So I could see where, you know, if it's not, I mean, that it's an important thing to continue measuring. And from a modeling standpoint, I'm less familiar, but, you know, I know nitrogen species writ large are not necessarily trivial to measure well or to get right in your models. So the more information we have, I think the better off we are.
So is there a proposal about how to craft this ammonia recommendation and whether or not it should be included in the letter to the administrator?
I want to make a comment though about the letter to the administrator. I don't think the top 3 or top 5 recommendations needs to dive too much into technical part of it. For example, the first thing that we said was that the high value of CASTNet, that's easy for anybody to understand. And we know that the administrator mentions environmental justice in all his presentations. So I know, so we have to find a way to put that in there. And I think Katie did allude to that. Yeah, so we keep it simple at the beginning. Then in the body of the report, we can get into technical. So we have to put a simplified recommendation that is easy to capture. Because what you want is to whet his appetite to dive deeper into the report. But if he gets too technical at the beginning, then there may be an issue there.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe I'm trying to do two things at once because I realized we didn't actually have clarity on what the group thought about ammonia monitoring, and it seems pretty important since the network shut it down, and the question is kind of hanging out there since you're recommending to bring some of it back. So I think Sally and Wei-Ting were going to cover that topic area. Do you feel like you have enough to clarify that recommendation?
Yeah, I saw the session on the different mentions of ammonia, but I think there is some mention of ammonia versus a mention of ammonium. And, the ammonia level is going up for sure. I wasn't sure about ammonium because sulfate has been going down, and that drags down quite a bit of the ammonium. So, I would like to see actually some citations in terms of which part of the country will have an increase in ammonium, because the control of sulfur dioxide has been doing quite a lot of good job in reducing ammonium also. But I wasn't, there's actually a really nice session written on it. I was just sure who wrote that. If you, wrote the part about ammonia and ammonium, maybe we can, work together when we, harmonize all this.
I'm guessing it was Doug Burns.
Okay. And reach out to him. Yeah. There's a whole nice session on it. So.
Okay, so we can circle back with him and get that clarified. So if the group's fine with empowering Sally to work with Doug to get the ammonia recommendation clarified, then I think we can move on. Thumbs up on that? All right, good. All right, well, in the interest of time, it's 5:40. I'd like to move forward on the agenda to offer the agency the opportunity to make clarifying comments and to ask any questions before we have our quick discussion of next steps and adjourn. So if you could maybe stop sharing your screen and let Dr. Weber take the floor. We'd like
Trying to get myself off mute. So I did this when we all met in May, and I want to do it again. And thank you so much for all the time and effort that you have put in. And the draft report was very, very helpful. This conversation and the distillation of the recommendations and crystallizing them a little bit further, which seems to be the topic of today's conversation, is going to be even more helpful in the final report. So again, my sincere gratitude for all of the time and effort you guys have put in. It's really, really helpful, both for us substantively and, in terms of the program within the agency. I'm going to clarify one thing, and then I'm going to cede a couple of my minutes to Melissa, who's on as well, and who you all know from May was actually, really knows the instrumentation and is the brains behind the operation, as opposed to me. I'm just a manager. So there was a question early on about sort of air pollution transport. And while we didn't sort of call that out specifically in charge questions, and I think that's because it's so ingrained in us, the programs that we implement, from starting with the Acid Rain program to now the Casper family of programs and the Good Neighbor Plan, which we're implementing now, are all regional transport programs, right? So CASTNet has, from its inception, been used for program accountability for Clean Air Act programs that are meant to improve regional air quality and address that regional transport. So that is the central part of our mission in our reason for keeping CASTNet going is looking at that transport signal. So I wanted to clarify that, because that was a question early on this afternoon. I'm going to turn it to Melissa on the both the ozone analyzers and on, I think, ammonia and versus ammonium as well. Melissa, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, there was a question earlier about the ozone analyzers and the age of them, and I think we sort of circled around the right answer. But just to clarify, we purchased most of the analyzers back in the 2010, 2011 timeframe, but the majority of the sites got new analyzers 13 or so years ago. But in the meantime, we have purchased new analyzers that, we rotate them throughout the entire network. They get sent back to the lab. They have parts replaced, the lamps, the solenoids, things like that. So then they are installed at a different site as needed. But, at this point, we're still very confident in the current technology and the analyzers that we have deployed. We get good data completeness, but we also at the same time realize they're approaching the end of their expected lifespan with the manufacturer, letting us know that they'll no longer be supported in the near future. So just wanted to clarify. Hopefully that helps with that discussion and how you frame that in the report. Another thing, Olivia, you mentioned the DOI, and was that for the data or for the actual articles in the bibliography?
Oh, yeah, for the data. So I was just thinking that instead of like having to maintain a bibliography manually of all the data that's used, like if the data could have a DOI and then, you could use that to build a bibliography, using Web of Knowledge or something like that.
Yeah, so the filter pack and the ozone data have a DOI. I don't actually know if anyone has ever used it. So that's a good suggestion, and we can highlight that maybe in a few different places on our website where it's currently buried. So thank you for clarifying, and we will we'll take that recommendation as a fairly simple thing to implement, hopefully. And then one other thing, and Brian, just give me like the cut if I've used too much time here, but for the continuous and high time resolution analyzers, appreciate Sally's recommendation, and keeping the Ascent sites running and doing the comparison. Throughout the report, I think it was, there were sort of conflicting messages on implementing the continuous technology. And I just, if there could be some clarity on what technology, maybe in addition to what's being put out at Ascent, which will give us the aerosol species that we currently measure, plus a lot more, of course, but then we still have nitric acid, and what to do with that, with the filter pack. And then also thinking about the other measurements that we can get off the filter pack, organic nitrogen and things like that, considering what that means going forward. So I guess if there's technology out there that you would recommend to get at nitric acid, if we modernize to the continuous measurements for aerosols, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, that would come back to maybe the gas, adding the gas phase, measurement too. But in terms of the organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen, the current technology with the mass spectrometers, there's a way to actually apportion organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen. So we have done a lot of that in my group too with the mass spectrometers at Ascent.
Okay.
So maybe we can add more of that information if that information is helpful in the report.
Okay.
And you can get at nitric acid with denudor difference techniques and a regular NOx analyzer. But it's tricky, but it can be done.
Yes. Right. Okay. Yes, we have that at one of our sites. It's helpful. Okay. Thank you. And Rick, you're muted.
Thank you. I'll jump back in real quick. And there's one thing that sort of has not come up today, is climate change and sort of climate change, air quality kinds of interactions. And obviously, that is the one of the most pressing issue confronting us right now and going forward. So if there's any way of thinking about, sort of what are the most important ways that current CASTNet observations and data support understanding the interaction between climate and air quality, and or are there additional instruments or analyses of currently collected data that could be added, in going forward as we modernize the network that would contribute to that understanding? I think that would be something of interest to the agency. So.
I mean, the ozone data you're collecting is certainly valuable for that. Background ozone in rural areas is going up. And I don't know in New York if it's due to the temperature or due to the less NOx. So that's something that.
Yeah.
Making that connection in the report, right? That CASTNet is important for understanding climate impacts and air quality would be a good thing, right? Because that makes it relevant for now. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
I'm sorry about that.
I'll just say that I think that it's in. I'm not quite sure the current version of the report that you're seeing, Richard, but there was some discussion about climate change, and I've been working with Brian to further hone that. But yeah, I will personally make sure that is well represented, because I think that that's a huge contribution of the network.
Thank you. That would be very useful, because it's, again, it's the prime, environmental issue that the agency is facing and is focused on, 150%. And so, making that connection would be useful.
So thank you so much, Rick and Melissa. And we got about 10 minutes left, and Sarah's been patiently waiting with her hand up. Since I'm not showing my screen, I could see it. So you're up.
Yeah. Not that patient, but just related to that last comment. I think that given the way Katie framed those top three pieces for the letter, it could certainly be folded in under the first one, the importance of maintaining what you're doing if you're trying to look for a signal like climate change. So I think it could be an easy sort of sub piece of that recommendation to mention climate change and how important it is to maintain long-term monitoring in order to detect some of those changes.
All right, so that's a good recommendation, and that's a nice way to wrap this discussion up. So just include the climate mentioned in that letter for the administrator and make sure that that's consistent across the report. Thank you so much. And thank you all very, very, very much. So we're going to move on to next steps unless there's any last burning desire that absolutely has to be addressed before we move on. Hey, nothing heard. So the next steps are we need a motion to decide the dispensation. And I think at this point it's probably pretty clear that if somebody's willing to, the motion is going to be along the lines of recommending the report be revised by the people identified and sent around by email for an email concurrence. So if anybody agrees that's the motion they want to make, they can make it, and then we can vote.
Well, I'm assigned to one of those items, so I certainly make that motion.
Okay, and does anybody second it?
I second.
Okay, all in favor of the motion to have the appointed people revise the report and send it around for an email concurrence, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Is anybody opposed? Say nay. Okay, no nays were heard, all ayes, so the motion passes. So the next steps are I will work in support of the writing leads and the chair to collect all the bits and pieces, put it into a coherent draft, and he and I will review it. When he decides that it's finished, we'll send it around for concurrence. How long do you want to take to do your edits? Probably faster is better than slower. I don't know what your schedules are, but usually when things are fresh in my mind, it flows a lot easier. So did you want like 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months? How about 2 weeks as a compromise?
That sounds good.
That works.
Okay, so draft revisions from each of the leads due to me in 2 weeks. And I'll send this out in an email to remind everybody. And then if there's any questions or comments, just let me know.
Brian, do you prefer track changes or how does that work for you?
Well, so you can do track changes and that makes things easier for me. But if you send it to me with not track changes, I do a compare and create a track changes version. So, you know,
okay,
whatever is easiest for you, really, at the end of the day.
okay.
Yeah.
Brian, do we all edit together one document or with
Yeah,
we have different revisions to do?
Yeah, at this point, you know, it's sort of ambiguous about the shared documents. But since it's less than half of the group, I think I could share a document on SharePoint again, and you all could edit the same document if that would work better. You can just give me a thumbs up. Okay, I'll do that. And I think we'll be fine with the rules of FACA on that. So.
And you will share this later spreadsheet with all the points that we discussed today. The Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, I'll have that too. So I'll be providing you some materials and a link to the SharePoint document. And we'll work together on that and bring it to a close in the next 2 weeks. And then we'll send it around shortly after that for concurrence. Any final thoughts from you, Uzo, as the chair?
Well, I just want to thank the committee, the panel, for working very, very hard and very diligent to get this done. And we thank all of you. And we look forward to bringing this to an end soon.
All right. Any last thoughts or comments from anybody in the group? Tom, Brendan, did you want to say the last word?
Wow, thank you, Brian, for the honor. Great job, terrific meeting. I look forward to seeing the revised draft, and everyone have a great evening.
Thank you very much. I hereby adjourn this meeting, and I look forward to wrapping this all up with you over the next 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.